Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Romina Ichon. In this episode, Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications and based in our Sacramento office, sat down with Steve Greenhut, Western Regional Director of the R Street Institute and columnist for the Orange County Register and American Spectator. Steve and Tim had a wide-ranging discussion on the legislation just passed at the end of this legislative session, from wildfire response to bail reform, renewable energy mandates to single-payer health care, and finally, Governor Brown's legacy. We think you'll enjoy this.
Stephen Greenhut, welcome to Next Round with PRI. It's great to have you on again for what's becoming our annual tradition of our end of legislative session wrap-up. As we know, some very controversial issues dominated the conversation in the last weeks of the legislative session, so let's talk about some of them. First was an issue that I know you followed very closely, and that was the 2-year-long effort to reform California's plagued bail system. You know, we saw lots of back and forth between the governor and the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court and the legislature itself. But a final deal on the measure proved controversial itself, and you saw even some original backers of the effort turn around and become last-minute opponents to the bill. And even in the days since the governor signed the bill into law, the bail industry has filed a referendum on the issue, and voters could end up deciding this. So maybe first could you start and explain to our listeners what you see as the current problems with the bail system, and then give your thoughts on the circus that was bail reform this session and how you ultimately think this issue will shake out.
It's very costly because, you know, the state has to pay for your for you being in jail, and you are not able to get home to pay the rent to keep to take care of your kids, and it's an unjust system. And what we found is that people who can't make bail are 3 times more likely to plead guilty to the charges than people who can, which means, and it's obvious why, because if you're sitting there languishing in jail and you don't have the money, you're much more apt to cut a plea deal, and it won't necessarily be a very favorable plea deal. It really gives prosecutors who hold all the power anyway, it gives them a lot more power. But if you're wealthy and accused of a very serious crime, you can post bail in most cases and go home. There are some incidents where a judge can keep you in anyway, but it's not a fair system. But what we found in Maryland, where they've experimented with eliminating bail, we found that often the judges, and there you have elected judges, don't let people out. So now that it shifts it to a judicial finding on whether you get out, so we're finding people are staying in jail even longer, which kind of undermines the reformers' goal. It also undermines the contention from the law and order crowd who claim that the criminals will be running loose. That's not at all what's happening. So both sides were kind of wrong on that. And the final compromise in California gives a lot more power to the judicial folks to make determinations to keep people in. So the ACLU, for instance, which supported getting rid of the bail system, they ended up coming out against it. And that was my view. I supported the initial bail reform, and then I wrote a column opposing it. I thought that Jerry Brown should have vetoed the bill, done some serious research, and come back. But of course, the bail industry, they don't like it because it's an existential threat. Their industry is over, essentially. I don't know what their chances of qualifying it for the ballot, and I really haven't seen any polling, but I don't imagine it would be that sympathetic of a cause. I think the bail system might actually be done, but they might have to fix the judicial system that now replaces it. So now we'll have to have judicial reform.
Very interesting, and I think it's one that we're not going to be done talking about in the next legislative session. That's for sure. Another kind of leftover, well, not really leftover, but we didn't resolve everything this year and we'll be dealing with next year's the response to wildfires. And there was a huge push by PG&E to try to get the legislature and the governor to agree to sort of limit their liability from the Santa Rosa wildfires of last year, which were, I don't know that we need to say allegedly, were pretty much agreed upon that their utility line sparked the fire. Now we have this year's wildfires and all the response to that, and they kind of all got merged into one. So we had a deal emerge at the end of the session where some of the issues were addressed, but that issue of liability was kind of addressed but kind of punted to next year. So what are your thoughts on the sort of the deal that came together? Will it make any positive difference in future wildfires? And what kind of cans have we kicked down the road to next session that we still need to deal with?
Yeah, we're dealing with regulated utilities who are granted a monopoly status in their area, and then we protect them from liability, which is essentially what this does. I'm not well versed in the details of the final bill, but it is essentially a bailout of the utility companies. So they basically have it both ways. They get a guaranteed customer base, a government-granted monopoly, and then the government comes in and protects them from liability for things that their infrastructure seem to have caused. So I think it's a bad system, and it's certainly not going to encourage the utilities to be more careful. I mean, if these aren't... So I find the whole situation frustrating, and I don't like our utility system as it is. And they're so concerned about the utility death spiral as people move towards solar, and of course the solar industry subsidized too. So it's a really frustrating to me. I mean, we don't have anything close to a market energy system, and I still remember the days of the electricity deregulation, and where we deregulated the wholesale costs, but we capped the retail costs, and then PG&E went bankrupt, and I think a lot of people are still paying those stranded costs. Remember interviewing one utility official who said he's he's one of the few officials in the country who makes money by remodeling his office, because they're paid a profit based on how much they spend. So I don't think this is a good idea to protect them from liability.
Yeah, there was the B word, bailout, was tossed around a lot in the debate over those bills. And I guess the last thing they did was they let the utilities could issue bonds to cover the costs of these big expenses. You know, there's the big fear of we can't let PG&E go bankrupt. But I remember them coming around and saying that, I think it was 2014, and for the big wildfires then. So it's going to be interesting to see going forward, and with a new governor, you know, how does that change the equation? Because it seemed like Jerry Brown was kind of in favor of this sort of liability limiting issue. I remember on the Gray Davis, I remember back in the day when we were going through the blackouts, there was the whole big deal over he signed all these power contracts with the state at a huge cost to taxpayers. And my contribution to that whole thing was I ran on one day, we scrambled to put in the Public Records Act request to whatever agencies, I think it was DWR and whoever, and I had to figure out how to write a Public Records Act request and submit it to the right agencies, to get denied 10 days later and told you could not have any of that information.
Yeah, that's how these public record requests go. But anyway, it's not I don't think this is the finest hour of the legislature.
Probably the biggest news of the last week of session was this bill to go to 100% renewable, SB 100. And, you know, there were enough arms twisted in the final days of session to kind of push it through. We've studied this issue, and these sort of well-meaning government sort of green energy programs really actually increase people's energy bills and hurt people who are poor and living in rural communities the most, especially, you know, it's hotter there. They need to run more air conditioning, and, you know, so we're going to see more energy poverty, we think, because of this. So do you think this bill is something that is realistic? Are we actually going to get to 100% renewable based on this government mandate, or is this another one of these governed by fiat sorts of things from Sacramento that isn't going to become reality?
Well, there's an old saying about if you want to scare people, if you're in the government and you want to scare people about a crisis, you don't want it to be in the next 5 or 10 years, because that's too soon and people will be able to hold you accountable. You don't want to make it too far in the future, because then people won't get worried about it. So you have to find the time frame. So, and that's what this seems like, an equivalent to that, where it's 27 years away, 2045. So it's far enough away that nobody who's in the legislature now is going to be in the legislature then, and probably not even in public life by then. So it's far enough away that no one's too worried about it. And I think it's much ado about publicity and having the right motives and the right goals, because those, mostly the 100% renewables, that's their goals. They're not mandates. So of course there's any millions of type of legislative changes will happen to it between now and then, and it's just a mandate. Of course, just a goal. They increased the mandate to 60%, which figured the mandate they can increase because it could probably be attained. There'll be a cost, as you point out. It's going to hurt poor people. There's a reason we have the highest poverty rate in the country. It's basically housing costs, energy costs, gasoline costs, costs of starting a business, with the cost of living. That's under the Census Bureau's cost cost of living adjusted poverty measure. And this just, of course, adds to that. And as you aptly pointed out, the wealthier people in this state tend to live along the coast. Poorer people live inland where you're really more dependent. I mean, try living in Bakersfield in August or Reading or Yucca Valley or some of these places where it's beastly hot. And you need that air conditioning running, and it's just going to add to it. The other thing, I was reading an article it's kind of interesting, is to achieve these goals, at least it's probably not achievable under current technologies, but with our current technologies, the amount of land that would have to be used for windmill farms and for solar farms, I mean, it's unbelievable. And we have the other part of the environmental community in this state is really focused on land use issues and protecting land and protecting endangered species. And of course, the wind farms are not good for endangered birds. And do we really want to be using land that way? Near where I live in a rural area outside of Sacramento, and we see these solar panel farms coming up. I'm sure they're fine as a portion of the energy grid, but do we really want to see all the farmland covered with solar panels? The way technology updates these things too, they keep getting smaller and smaller over the years. So I imagine that whatever you build now, the current crop of solar panels is not going to be what's state of the art 10, 15, 27 years from now. So I think there are a lot of land use problems in addition, and we need to use more of our land for housing given the housing crisis. So it seems like a lot of nonsense.
Liberals didn't win every battle this year, and there was actually two battles that happened right before summer recess that I think were one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen. So we changed the initiative process a little bit, where if you qualify an initiative for the ballot, you can go to the legislature and say, okay, I've qualified this. Basically, if you cut a deal with me on what I want, we can withdraw our measure from the ballot. And two outside groups did this to varying, well, the reaction was pretty similar, but they were more mad on one than the other. So a rich gentleman qualified a California-only online privacy measure that, by all accounts, was pretty unworkable, good intent, but pretty unworkable. When presented to the legislature, they chose to cut a deal with this guy and pass something that seemed like it was just as bad, if not worse, in its own way. The soda industry took a different tactic. They were tired of these local soda tax measures, so they qualified a measure to say that local tax increases on the ballot would have to be a 2/3 vote, including things on the ballot this year. So all these local officials went nuts, and the legislature kind of had a gun to their head, and they agreed to have a moratorium on soda sales taxes for, I think it's 12 years. So what do you make of this? I kind of feel like I loved the soda tax one. I thought that was, whatever you think of the issue, I thought that was kind of just desserts to see the legislature being treated like they treat every other regulated industry in the state. But I kind of feel like we have a missed opportunity because that ballot measure the soda industry was pushing sounds pretty good to me.
Well, right. I think the liberals probably won on that one because in cutting a deal, we're not going to have a chance to limit the ability of local governments to increase taxes. I think it went to a case. Was it in Claremont? It was somewhere up in that direction. It was a marijuana dispensary case, but it really just had to do with how local governments could pass tax increases, and it provided a giant loophole for them to pass taxes potentially without a vote of the public. So had the soda guys, they cut their own self-interested deal. They were bankrolling the whole tax repeal issue, and now we miss a chance to make it harder for cities to increase taxes in a broader way. And also, I think the health nannies are qualifying their own ballot to impose a statewide sugary tax. I don't know where that stands, where the latest, but I think it's for the next general election. So the beverage industry folks might end up losing out on both ways. They may just end up gaining a couple years of not having local taxes and might end up getting stuck with sugary taxes statewide. And knowing the way a lot of the state's voters are, I don't know. I'd be pretty weary or leery about how that one might go. So I don't know. But it was fun seeing the legislature with a proverbial gun to its head that way. But I don't think the taxpayer comes out well ahead. And on I think a lot of as far as the liberal direction of the state, the one I'm really looking at is the rent control initiative on the November ballot. If the rent control advocates are successful, we're going to see much more extreme types of rent control spreading across the state, and And that's in a state in a housing crisis. That's going to be one of the most awful things we could do.
So as we close, let's look back a little and look ahead. So this is the last session of Jerry Brown's way too many terms as governor. I think we have term limits still, so we won't be seeing him again. So what grade or what observations do you have kind of looking back on Jerry Brown, really this second 8-year incarnation? And what do you think we can expect with Gavin Newsom coming in? What kind of governor do you think he'll be in, right out of the gates? And how do you think he'll play with the legislature? He's certainly gung-ho about single payer and all of these other things. I feel like there's going to be some growing pains, regardless of who the governor is. But when confronted with the budget reality and the inevitable downturn that's going to come at some time.
My feeling on Brown is one of disappointment. I mean, here's a guy, he controlled the legislature, right? I mean, he was far more skilled politician than I think anybody in the Capitol. And I think he could have pushed for things that he just chose not to confront. So he spent his political capital on a bullet train that I doubt will ever come to fruition, on a twin tunnels project in the Delta that iffy, it's down to a single tunnel, and I don't know that it's going to happen. And on raising taxes, a lot of Republicans had no problem with him, they didn't have no problem with him, but they basically liked him. They realized he was like the last adult in Sacramento. He's a very likable character, and I've found him when I attended press conferences to be immensely entertaining and frank. And I remember once a reporter in the press pool asked why he was cutting social services, and he goes, "Well, that's where the money is." So that's the kind of guy he was. So I always liked that about him. He came up to me once at a press club event, and he came over. He goes, "You wrote something nice about me," and then he had some article author he wanted me to read. He just seemed like a real guy, and he was much more fiscally disciplined than a lot of the other Democrats. But he didn't take the opportunities. He never took the Nixon goes to China. He could have really reformed the pension system. He knows the problems. He's a brilliant guy. I don't like what he did with the transportation taxes. I think he signed record-setting budgets, and he never really took on the state's issues in a way he could have. I mean, his Pension Reform Act of 2013, PEPRA, was extremely modest, and the main goal of it, as I saw, was to prove to the public that they were serious about dealing with debt, so that the public would pass Prop 30 tax increase. So I just think it was a missed opportunity. He had Democrats eating out of his hands, and Republicans were not extremely opposed to him. They realized the reality and that he was as good as we were going to get. So that's how I feel about Brown. A colorful, wonderful figure in California's history. He could have done a lot more, and I just find it disappointing. As far as Gavin Newsom, I got to interview him once on the marijuana issue, and I was surprised I wasn't surprised. I just was got to see how smart he was. He was very smart, and he really knew the policy. So I like that about him. Now, that's what scares me about him, because a lot of the policies that he likes, like single payer, I think would doom the state. And he hasn't signed on or taken a supportive position of some of the specific proposals legislators, but he's kind of promised to promote single payer, and that could disrupt our entire economy here. And if you want to see people are leaving because of the regulations and taxes, you impose single payer and you disrupt our ability to get good health care. And you guys said Sally Pipes over at PRI knows this better than anybody on what these kind of single payer deals will do and how they will destroy health care. If we get something like that in the state, and no other state's going to do it. So, and the bill that passed the Senate, it's for all comers. You don't have to be a resident of the state for any set period of time. You just have to be here. So that's just a nightmare, and will kill our tax burdens and kill our healthcare system. I'm scared about that. There are things I like. I think there's a side to Gavin Newsom, though, that's got kind of that Bay Area tech Democrat who seems to show occasional libertarian signs in very modest ways. He seems to understand the dynamics of the economy. I also think, as I mentioned, he's extremely smart. He's savvy. I think at the end of the day, we'll see a lot of posturing about single payer. I don't think anything much will happen, and I think he's going to end up governing a lot like Governor Brown. That would be my 2 cents.
I fear with single payer, and I think it's going to be interesting to watch next year, I fear this is going to become a ballot fight. That the nurses senators and the real advocates will give him the benefit of the doubt maybe in this next 2-year session. But if they don't get what they want, I could see this coming to a ballot near you in probably 2022 or 2024, and that could be a real disaster if something like this happens by initiative. I mean, they'd be a very hard thing to fight at the ballot box, given, how hard is it to, who's against free health care for all? That's a hard thing, to be against. The other thing I find interesting about Gavin Newsom is he can be Fidel Castro-esque in his speech making. I mean, you literally need to get the hook, or he'd be giving. I saw him give a speech last year at the press club, and he talked about his marijuana plan, and he had a gun plan that year too. He literally, they practically had to beg him to stop to take questions, and he was going to go on for another 2 or 3 hours on his thing. So I hope you don't have to cover his state of the state next year, because you might not be awake. But it's going to be an interesting change, and I think the pent-up demand of some of the left in the legislature, where Brown could just say, "That's stupid, forget it," and he literally would talk like that, or "That's wonderful, how are you going to pay for it?" I think that's going to be fascinating to see. Does Gavin go along with these, or is he like Jerry and say, you know what, stay in the course, and peace and prosperity is a pretty good success to stay here for 8 years?
Yeah, I think that sums up the question, what we're going to see, and yeah, Brown does have a great way of just saying, no, I'm not for that, and then everyone knows it's a dead letter. And I think you're right, fundamentally right, though, that this whole single payer thing has become the big cause of the left, and the left ascendant here in California, and I think it's beyond whoever's governor, because this is going to end up I would think at a ballot initiative, and that's going to be a disastrous problem. And so we certainly will see.
So last thing before we wind up. So this is kind of your chance. There's always a whole bunch of issues that don't get the coverage that you think they should get. So what's kind of the one thing that you've looked into this year that people should be paying attention to, but they haven't been?
I think there's some obscure things that are important that I know here at our Street Institute, we sponsored a bill. It was Mike Morell's bill that would have eliminated occupational licensing for shampooers. So if you want to shampoo hair, you still have to get the full barbering and cosmetology exam, which could cost you $19,000, 10 months of full-time schooling, so that you can shampoo people's hair. And there are apps that send people to elderly people's homes to do hair. And it passed out of the Senate and it got killed in the Assembly. But occupational licensing is really important. We're always talking about, the left and the right are talking about helping poor people and middle-class people get good jobs. And yet we have these onerous occupational licensing rules that make it very difficult and expensive for young people to get jobs and develop careers. The government basically bans certain types of work, and unless you put in all this money and time, and a lot of those rules, a lot of what you learn has nothing to do with what you're actually going to be doing. So that's one issue. It's a smaller issue, but I think it's important. And I think this year we saw a lot of criminal justice reform measures. I think the criminal justice system needs a lot of reform, but it needs more of a scalpel than an axe. It's a really complex issue, and the consequences of doing it wrong could be extremely dangerous. But some of the ideas I thought were like bail reform. The idea, not the actual final thing, were good. The idea of putting some limits on the police ability to use force. I've covered a lot of these things. Extremely disturbing. It's too tilted in one direction. But one bill that we supported, and I wrote an article about, and it is on the governor's desk, is a good example of something important. SB 1303. In most of the counties in California, the sheriff and the coroner are the same person, and the sheriff has the final say on the coroner's decision. To me, if someone is killed, the coroner ought to decide what the medical evidence is, and then the sheriff and the prosecutors can make their decision on what they're going to do about it. And there was a scandal in San Joaquin County where the medical examiner resigned after he alleged that the sheriff who lost election was interfering with these decisions, and that just seems to be a conflict of interest. And I think that's an important bill. I hope the governor signs it. But the science ought to be the science, and the political decision ought to be the political decision. And what we find with some of these police shootings shooting issues where sheriffs aren't going to, they're not going to want the shooting to be determined a homicide if a police officer is involved in it, in a way to protect the police officers. And that what the political decision should be made on the best evidence based on the science. So that's Richard Pan's bill, and that's a good one. And
well, thank you so much again for joining us for our now annual tradition to have our end of session wrap. And if folks want to follow what Our Street's doing and read your latest columns, where can they go do that?
It's ourstreet.org, and you can see my columns on the Orange County Register, ocregister.com website, and American Spectator, spectator.org.
Thanks to our guest, Steve Greenhut, and to my colleague, Tim Anaya. To read more of Steve Greenhut's work, go to the R Street Institute website at rstreet.org. And save this date. Our Sir Anthony Fisher Gala in San Francisco takes place on Saturday, November 10th. Our keynote speaker is none other than author and media commentator Mark Stein. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come again for another episode of Next Round with PRI.